thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You,
for sure.
as individuals and as organizations, are doing incredible things on the cutting edge of what's possible. Let's start with Andy. Tell us about your personal journey through how you captured and conveyed information during the Arab Spring.
Well, in many ways, I would consider myself an accidental journalist. I never sought out to be in the news business. My background was actually in internet policy. I was a policy wonk for a long time, focusing on education technology and broadband issues. But through that work, I began to learn very quickly the power of having a community around you to support what you're doing. The first online community I ever built was 20 years ago this year. 20 years ago. I was working on an education technology website, and I was straight out of college, honestly didn't know what I was talking about, but started hearing from some very smart people who had tough questions for me. So I think rather than acknowledge how little I knew, I figured, why don't I get these people to talk to each other? And so I created a listserv that will have its 20th anniversary in December. And that became the first of a number of online communities I developed over the years under the premise that there are a lot of people out there who will know a lot more about this stuff than I ever will. And if you can get them talking to each other, then it goes exponential from there. And so
it's like the un-Anchorman.
Something like that, yeah. For about 7 years, I ran a project called the Digital Divide Network, which was a nonprofit social network focusing on internet rights and internet access around the world. And while working on that, I had the chance to pull together a variety of online groups to respond to disasters like Katrina, the Boxing Day tsunami, et cetera. So by the time I got to NPR in 2006, I already had a basic idea of how to build communities, but then the challenge was, how do I integrate this into the news? And then Twitter came along. And probably starting with the Mumbai bombings 5 or 6 years ago, where I aggregated tweets and live tweeted what was going on for those 3 or 4 horrific days, I really saw that there was an opportunity to connect with people in distant places. And then when Sidi Bouzid happened, when the young man set himself on fire in Tunisia, I happened to know a few people in Tunisia, and I saw them tweeting about it. And so we started talking, I started retweeting them, people started coming to me with questions, and it just blossomed to the point where I realized after about 6 weeks, I wasn't doing my job anymore, and instead I was spending 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, acting as a news DJ for half a dozen revolutions in the region. And that went on for 18 months straight. And it wasn't just me finding stuff and curating it and sending it out. People started volunteering for me, working as translators, researchers, fixers. People would track shipping lanes for me, flight paths, tail numbers on planes just in case a dictator decided to leave the country. All sorts of crazy stuff that I would have never come up with myself. But these were things that they were passionate about. And so I was basically able to take their passions and channel it to a big news story and have them collaborate around it.
Obvious question that you mastered long ago, but shed us some light on how you achieved a certain degree of confidence in how real or verifiable these pieces of information were.
Well, let's take Libya, for example. It took a little while for Western journalists to get into Libya. And so for that first week especially, there was a lot of footage coming out of there that no one knew what to make of. I mean, the very first videos I saw were coming out of a town in the East Coast named Derna, and it was a day before the official revolution was supposed to start. So they jumped the gun. They were so excited. But here came the videos. And a lot of editors didn't know what to do with this stuff because they said, how do we know this isn't Tunisia? How do we know this isn't from Egypt? So I started asking my Twitter followers, take a look at this stuff. Tell me what you see. Tell me what you hear. And people would get back to me and say things like, well, I'm Egyptian or I'm Tunisian, and I recognize that accent is coming from eastern Libya. Or I've been to Benghazi, and I recognize that's the Benghazi courthouse right there, and if you go to Google Earth, you'll be able to match it. Or if you listen to that call to prayer in the background, it matches the timestamp, and so you could rule out it being at this time rather than that time. And again, these were things that probably would have never occurred to me, but because I had a critical mass of Twitter followers around me wanting to get to the heart of the story, we basically became an ecosystem for sussing out the truth.
It sounds like data on a scatter plot. kind of, the scatter plot of the story. You were
It's,
populating.
yeah, I mean, it is in a way, but after a while, that scatter plot can come into focus. And so there's still editorial judgment that has to come into play. But if you know enough of those people know what they're talking about, and they're figuring out things independently, and it's all triangulated well, then you're usually on the right path.
So now Andy gets meta. And you wrote a book, so you're already meta. But getting meta, it's a great book that you guys should all read. But
thank you.
You kind of became the thinker of and proponent of networked journalism, collaborative community journalism, as a bigger phenomenon. So pulling away from the Arab Spring onto the broader landscape, where has it worked? Where has it not worked? How is the public playing a role in the storytelling in ways sort of?
Well, Reddit's a great example because they both can show us a situation where it can be done very poorly and when it can be done very well. Some of you may remember what happened on Reddit during the Boston bombing. A bunch of people came together on a subreddit trying to ID the Boston bombers. And they used all sorts of really interesting techniques to triangulate where people were looking and where they were staying at a certain time. But many of them basically based the premise on let's look for brown males. And the people that they narrowed it down to had nothing to do with the attack. And Reddit's reputation really took a hit, understandably so at that point. But they learned a lot of lessons from that. And so now if you go back to Reddit and take a look at some of the subreddits they've created for Syria, for Ukraine, they're becoming masters of the craft because they have developed their own networks around the world of potential sources. They have enough people within their communities who are taking on different roles, not only to keep posting interesting stories about these conflicts, they're running live blogs now. And these live blogs are just as good as anything you see coming out of, for example, The Guardian right now. It's really extraordinary.
So what are they achieving on the successful subreddit that traditional outlets aren't even able to replicate?
Well, I think they have a higher tolerance for incorporating news from a variety of different sources. You know, they don't have any stake in the game saying, we've got a scoop on something. And so if they get something useful from the Washington Post, they're just as likely to use that as if they got it from Vice, or if they got it from NPR, or if they got it from a citizen journalist they know on the ground. As long as they're able to determine that there's quality there, they're going to share it with everyone. And also, you know, they're willing to take more risks. I think in many ways they're doing what I did during the Arab Spring, where I would take information that hadn't been confirmed, that's already swirling out there on the internet, and acknowledging it. You know, most news organizations would typically pretend that rumor wasn't out there until they could disprove it or prove it. You know, it's incumbent upon at least some people in journalism to spend our time in these communities to say, wait a second, I think you've got it totally wrong here. You need to slow down, and you need to rethink this. Because think how things might have been different in that subreddit during the Boston bombing if just a few professional journalists had been hanging out there rather than standing outside saying, ha, they're getting it wrong. I mean, why are we so high and mighty that we're only concerned about our own platforms? We should be concerned about the general public and what they understand. And these online spaces and these platforms are now part of that knowledge. So we need to be a part of it if we're gonna do our jobs and really stick to a mission of creating a more informed public.
The news as the knowledge pool.
Essentially, yes.
You're amazing. Mr. Drake Martinet.
Thank you.
You are very interesting. You represent the same sort of sensibility of this openness and boldness and courage of Vice and now Vice News. Come from a different tack, focused on narrative video, right? So yes. Just tell us about how Vice sees news and what Vice News is going to do that nobody else is doing.
So first of all, I have to say it's impossible to follow Andy because he's changed the way that anyone who's paying attention thinks about how newsrooms should and can act. And so I think there was a moment early in your coverage of Tunisia where you started asking questions out on Twitter because you'd built the critical mass. And I was like, this is what happens inside of a newsroom, but they try and hide it from everyone so that all you see is the sausage at the end of the day.
Right.
but people expect honesty today, and especially people in a younger generation have I don't know what the rating of this video is, but a better bullshit detector than I think their previous generations. And so what Andy does doesn't smell.
Excuse me.
No, it's true. Well, and it I think there's a level of honesty that we aspire to in what will become the greater body of coverage at Vice News. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We're so Vice. I'll preface it by saying Vice News has only been live in public beta for about a week, and I have been at Vice for about a month. But I've been a fan of Vice for a long time, and what Vice has built its name on the internet are these immersive, sort of first-person video stories, stories in the broadest sense. They're about all kinds of things. And so around the time, there's this long narrative that has, I think, brought Vice to Vice News as the next logical conclusion for what a global youth platform needs to become involved with. I think a lot of it started with the documentary they did called Heavy Metal in Baghdad, where they were in the red zone while John McCain was in the green zone saying the war is over. And the filmmakers for Vice, this is way pre-Vice News, were saying, you know, this is the beginning of a civil war. There are very bad things happening here. In many ways, they were around these things for the first time, and so I think that changed them a little bit, and they moved towards news. And then the HBO show happened, and they said, they're like, not only do we have the great capacity to do this at Vice, but there is such a thirst for this kind of programming within our core audience. Young people want unfettered access to stories that are hard to tell, and whether they're on the left or they're on the right, or they live in Mexico or New York or Alabama, kind of the only thing that unites this generation is that they feel like they've been lied to by people with really great haircuts. They're disenfranchised. They're or emotionally so, if not truly, because that's a strong word. And bringing real stories to those people is, in a news capacity, is absolutely the next logical step.
And you've done it in incredibly bold ways, not just because your people get shot at, but because you've deployed technology toward that mission, that sort of optimizing for story.
Well, I want to start by saying, when you say you, she doesn't mean me. She means really amazing people I work with. Because I sit in an office in New York and try and help all of those people have access to resources and technology and platforms and security and all the things that we can do to arm them to bring these incredible stories to the audience.
And you armed one of them with Google Glass. Tim
Tim has a sort of, I guess, cut his teeth in the Occupy movement, kind of became the guy who was out there putting cameras in the air, on his head, anywhere he could to document that sort of youth movement within the U.S. And then, I think a lot of the emotionally related movements that have happened and are happening around the world. But it's not just Google Glass. It's anytime there's a story, there are right ways to tell it. There are the best way to convey those truths. Sometimes it's pictures, sometimes it's audio, sometimes it's video. I mean, video is the great fusion of both of those things. And so I think where we come at it is video is the thing we aspire to. And if we're going to a place where video is not possible, we basically want to build technology that makes bandwidth the only variable. If the bandwidth is there, we can bring you a great video story. If it's not there, if we're in the Central African Republic, if we're in parts of Venezuela that, for maybe some suspicious reasons are having bandwidth problems, we can still bring you something. So building a news organization with a stack of technology that will always bring the story.
So how did it work with Venezuela, for example?
So Venezuela, this was all like pre-launch, by the way. We're sort of, in addition to launching vicenews.com, which we just did into the sort of public beta in the way that things are beta, and the Vice News YouTube page, which all of our stuff goes there as well. We had people on the ground already feeding in stuff from Venezuela, and we had a team there who wanted to get live video out. There were bandwidth problems, sort of we could do video, and then we couldn't do video, and then we couldn't even talk to them, and then all of a sudden we got a phone call, and that was what we had. So we're sitting in the office. It was actually my colleague Sterling and some of our senior editors and Tim and some other people saying, okay, how do we get this? Like there's a live thing happening on the ground right now. How do we tell this story? And as it turns out, we basically ended up doing radio on YouTube because the bandwidth prohibited us from bringing live video. They were capturing stuff on the ground that we could then get later. But the story needed to be told live, and it needed to be told now, and no one else was able to get it out. So we had, cross-connecting wires out of phones into laptops, into a video compression box, back into a laptop, and then swung back around to a guy, tapping at a keyboard, channeling in questions, and responding to questions in YouTube, while the reporter is talking on, sort of on air, if you want to call it that. And what you got is a fully interactive radio program run on YouTube because that's the bandwidth that was available. So
you describe that to me as bringing a hacker mentality to journalism, and that's happening in a bigger way. That's actually very good for the craft.
I think so. I think one of the most amazing things that's happening, and this is true of all kinds of civic engagement. It's true of all of you who work out in social good and in the nonprofit space. There's not a ton of tools that are successfully developed, purpose-built for news, purpose-built for people working at NGOs. But the really great ones don't care. They go, oh, this is an app that allows me to put my photo over the top of a background. I can actually use this to put a bug on the photos I'm taking and timestamp them so that there's some verifiability in terms of where and when this happened. Or this app is actually for regular old sound recording. I'm going to use it to make sure that what is happening right here, that this story is told. And so I think that's the way I describe it. I guess I worked in Silicon Valley for long enough that that's kind of how my mind is geared. But it's nothing about what it should do, everything about what it can do.
Andy, any reactions? No?
I think he's totally on the right track. I mean, part of what First Look is planning to do is, while on the one hand we're going to be building a news operation, mainly in New York, but in DC, Rio, and a few other places as well. We're also going to be building a tech hub in San Francisco, and part of the big goal of that entity is to develop brand new tools that can really optimize better journalism. And so we're planning to keep the journalist side of our business as a nonprofit, but at the same time, we'll have this separate company that exists for building tools initially based on the specs that we put out, so we can be more creative and innovative in our journalism, but then bringing in other clients as well, hopefully, and making those tools available to a broader public. So yeah, I mean, you got to have a hacker mentality to journalism, not only because I think it's a more appropriate way of thinking today when it comes to putting together stories. They're just the tools that are out there. I mean, you kludge them together, and it looks kind of cool the way you do it, but we can still do better. And we really need to try to do better.
Yeah, it's a discipline of incomplete information, of incomplete process, and of trying to figure out how to get it done by any means.
Right, absolutely.
I have found that bringing a project management mentality to how you cover a story has been a game changer.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of rigor, as opposed to like fly
Yeah,
by
I mean,
night.
for the last couple of years I was at NPR, I mean, we basically used Agile. We do daily stand-ups in different parts of the newsroom, certainly for all the people who are working on tools, our product managers for social. That became part of the culture. And with Piero Midyar founding First Look, he brings in a very Silicon Valley mentality in terms of management and iteration and all that. And so now we're basically trying to figure out, if we're building a newsroom from scratch, what are the best ideas that come out of that can really make our journalism better than anything else we've individually been able to produce before?
It's a powerful pivot for the industry. Everyone talks about the age where major philanthropists who made their money in technology come in and start meddling with the news space. But if you think about it, the way you've just given us a snapshot, kind of under the blanket, it's about process engineering. It's different, and that's going to change.
And it's not like Pierre's come into it completely out of from a vacuum. Before starting First Look, he launched the Honolulu Civil Beat. He helped create a local digital paper for his hometown. And you don't typically think of billionaires going hyper-local for the community they live in, but that's what he did. And I know that he had been very interested in social media for social good long before that. He, about 10 years ago, before the Omedio network really grew into a large foundation, it actually had its own social network. And he basically ran customer service for it. So while we're having these great conversations about how to make the world better, if the system went down, you'd message Pierre.
How funny.
And so he's a very down-to-earth kind of guy. At the same time, strongly understands and respects editorial independence. And so I'm really excited to see what we're going to come up with in the coming months.
Let me pause here. Any questions out in the crowd for our thinker speakers over here? I'll just call it out and I'll repeat it. Please. And your name and where you're from.
My name is Eduardo Small. I work in social media. Two questions. Would you consider both your companies partner with ABC News and ABC News CBS eventually? And the other question is, how do you plan to monetize your platforms?
Did everybody hear that? So the questions were, how do you partner with the big guys, the incumbents, ABC, CBS? Do you, and how do you? And then how do you monetize?
I can answer that pretty quickly. Well, I think I kind of explained the monetizing part because the tech business that we're going to build alongside the newsroom. But there will be other things we're going to experiment with. We do have a luxury of a bit of some financial padding that's going to let us get our act together, try different things. So in that sense, I think we're very lucky to be in that position. Regarding with partnering with broadcasters and all that, who knows? I mean, if there's value to it at some point, maybe. But we're not trying to be them. Our goal is not to create the next CNN or ESPN or anything like that. They do what they do. What can we do that's different and at the same time not only holds power to account, but makes it responsive to the public and empowers the public to do that as well? And so it's not just about informing people, it's about empowering them and making sure those institutions are responsive as well. So does that mean we partner with broadcasters at some point? I have no idea. I'd rather focus on the mission before I figure out those business partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that I'm going to give you an answer very similar to Andy's, but being a week old, in terms of monetization, I think our plans are to do all the things that digital media companies do to monetize their content, and without getting into too much nitty-gritty, which I'm happy to talk to you about after. And then, but the point is, we're hoping to actually make money on doing what we do. And then, when it comes to partnerships, I think the core focus for Vice News, and one of the underlying premises is that the big guys, quote unquote, don't do for our audience what they do. And so I think, God who knows, like, I don't know if it made sense. I'm sure all kinds of great partnerships could happen, but we're going for an audience that is underserved and that is demanding a news product that services them, and they're already voting with their feet. If you look at demos for a lot of these quote unquote big guys, and that's the space that we're trying to fill.
So for our organization, we do partner with the big guys. ABC News, The Guardian, Vice, others have all, New York Times, have all used our content when they need it, and we've been very glad to distribute it that way. We knew up front that we were never going to be able to monetize the content. There's a reason Syria doesn't get a lot of coverage as is. So we were really super scrappy. Even foundations, when we started off, kept telling us, we're not doing Syria. So when foundations tell you they're not doing Syria, you're kind of out of luck. We self-financed, completely bootstrapped. I spent my own savings to build the first prototype, and then people came to us to replicate the platform for partner projects. So last year, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, because we made $1 million last year doing that, and we spent it all paying people who started as volunteers, and then spending about $200,000 moving off WordPress and building our own thing. So it's basically a big fat leap of faith and betting on yourself. And then we're discovering over time the models for digital revenue streams that rely not on monetizing content, but monetizing your community. Added value services, pro products, live events, how you make that experience into more of a membership than a readership. A lot of social people in the social good space, they do something that's good for the world, and they recognize that means they have a skill set they can use for other things. And it's tricky because you kind of have to make sure you don't spend too much time on the money side so you can spend it on the things you care about creating. And it's tough in the first 14 months, but you know, we exist, so I guess it worked.
Lara, I really like your point about not treating the folks you work with on the ground as fixers, not as treating them as journalists, leaving them with something behind with the belief. As an industry, do you feel like both from the new startups that you all represent and from the larger industry, we're using more and more freelance journalists, using more and more local citizen journalists. Are we doing enough to protect them, given the state of press freedom around the world, both protect them from abuses and threats, but also protect them and build them up so that we are building a new network kind of journalism and leaving a stronger network behind after we go?
No, we're not. I think when it comes to freelancers and fixers and stringers around the world, I don't think we do enough to protect them in terms of their physical safety or their ability to practice their craft. One of the reasons why I was so eager to go to First Look was when Pierre first described it publicly, is one of the pillars he described was having a strong legal team that would essentially have the back of journalists around the world. So if governments or other entities start clamping down on groups of journalists or individual journalists, we can somehow be involved in one way or another. I mean, one of the people that's at First Look, for example, is Glenn Greenwald. And so he was with Jeremy Scahill and Laura Poitras rolling out our first site, The Intercept, about a month ago. And as many of you can imagine, there are legal issues hanging around Glenn's head. And so we think it's really important that if we're going to give our journalists the opportunity to challenge authority, we need to be prepared for that backlash. And sometimes that backlash will be the legal brunt of that authority, if not the physical brunt of it as well. And so we're hoping to build out a legal infrastructure. One of our first hires was a media lawyer. And you know, it's not the typical thing you'd see a startup having as one of their first handful of employees, but that's what we did, because we really want to create a foundation of having journalists' backs and at the same time making a very loud public statement about how we feel about freedom of the press and protecting it.
I think someone's media studies PhD should be written about the ethical dilemma of freelancers and local journalists who want to send you stuff that puts them in danger. They choose to do so, they put it out to the world. We have our own safeguards that we've done our best to put in place. Nobody wants to put journalists in danger, but it is happening. I'm not singling out anyone in particular, but our industry does have a bit of an abusive tendency. I know people who've suffered for it dearly, from major news organizations coming in and leaving behind their cell phone with people's numbers in it. It's not all tech. Some of it's logic. I think the paradigm shift that I'm playing with that I think is really important is this sort of a tendency to discount the local hire, you know, and the local hire as a hero and a very capable one. I also come from a family of people from where the local hires and the staff and the help, basically, the hired, you know, back in the family line, people who were the translators and the fixers, and they never get the glory. And then I float in as the foreign correspondent, and what? So I'm highly sensitive to that.
Let's put it this way. There are more than 30 journalists missing or in captivity in Syria right now. Some have been missing for upwards of, what, a year and a half? Perhaps longer than that. And a disproportionate number of them are freelancers or stringers. And I think it's quite possible in some of those cases things could have turned out better for them earlier if they had been, if the news organizations they were filing for had taken greater ownership and greater responsibility.
Can I interject, guys? I'm so sorry. Not part of the show. We have some folks who had questions. I didn't know if you could see them. So we've got a microphone. We don't want to miss those questions.
Oh, sure.
Cool.
So there's a gentleman here, for starters.
Oh. Thank you. Hi, my name's Will Butler. I'm actually a freelance writer. Full disclosure, I've written for Vice, and I used to work down the hall from you, Andy, when I was at NPR in 2010. Yep. But my question is, to kind of piggyback off that last one about protecting freelancers, I've heard very little about the role of rigorously edited content and analysis in the written word, and I'm wondering where that fits in this whole picture of the new world of journalism.
I think it's vital. I mean, if you take a look at what we've published so far in The Intercept, it's not like Glenn and his team are throwing darts at a wall with various Snowden documents on it and say, hey, we'll write a blurb about that today. You know, some of these stories they're putting up are literally months in the making. There is so much going on behind the scenes to make sure that these documents are understood and interpreted correctly, and that they're vetted in ways with people who have the expertise to do it. And so it's not like we're simply trying to become real-time curators of everything. There's a role for that, and I'm an advocate for that. But I'm also an advocate for kick-ass journalism that really, really shakes powerful institutions to their core and holds them accountable. And I'm up for doing that by whatever means necessary. And whether that's through good social journalism or great investigative journalism that takes a lot of time and a lot of work, I think both are great, and everything in between.
Yeah, and at Vice, I mean, you've written for Vice, so you know that there's a great place for written content. And I don't know that I've ever worked at a place that employs writers as smart as we employ at Vice News. Just some wicked smart people who are so deep into their beats that very little surprises them. And it's a huge component of what we need to do. Any modern, healthy digital media company publishes across the entire continuum of content, from 140 characters all the way up to a 2-hour-long feature documentary about something that we're absolutely going to produce. And on any given day, I mean, writing tends to be viewed as something that can happen more quickly and at higher volume than a great video piece. I think that can be possible, but the medium doesn't necessarily. Great stories are told through research, through vetting, through being places, and a lot of times the exact same effort it's going to take to go and find a story with our camera that's going to be required to do an equally good, narrative, long-form story about it.
Wait, how badly do you want to ask that question? Because we got 4 minutes left. Really badly? I can talk fast. Okay. I just want to make sure you guys have a chance to share any last thoughts.
I would actually rather hear the question.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
I wanted her to say I'm really passionate
Yeah.
for the pushback.
I am very curious for your answer, so that's an opportunity. Oh no.
Sorry. There we go.
Hi, I'm Catherine Cheney, and I work with a new media company called Nationswell, and we combine stories and action around American innovation and American renewal. And this is kind of an emerging model. There's Riot, Take Part. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk, along the lines of this revolution in journalism, what your thoughts are on combining stories and action and providing readers with a way to take action right on the page. It presents opportunities, but also challenges.
So I think that the direction a lot of this going is through enabling action at the end of a story. I think what we start with as journalists, and one of our duties is to help build empathy. And a huge talent of Vice News is never sterilizing whatever story it is that we tell. I mean, I think if you watch any of our stuff, really what you're doing is you're going to meet a person or several people, but you're meeting these individuals and you're connecting with them on a personal level, and you're coming to understand them, so that as sort of broad consumers of a story, say we understand Syria abstractly, that's something that's kind of hard to put your effort behind. But when you go to the Lebanese arms bazaar and you meet somebody who's being financed by a local political party to buy and then resell to a particular faction guns, and you see where this person lives, what this person's lot in life is like, you come to understand a lot more about what's actually going on in a place like that. And I think that's the first step that journalism has traditionally filled, even if it's a little bit sterile for our audience. But connecting with people and having a deeper understanding of the realities of a story, I think, is the first step. The next step, where this is all going absolutely, is enabling, and I think it's because young people demand this, the ability to both connect with a great story and then take some kind of action along the broad continuum of what you can do from retweet all the way to devote your life to this cause. That's the pantheon.
I'll keep this simple so maybe we can squeeze in one or two more questions, but I guess I'd say right now, I am very, very curious about this model.
So I have good news, which is that we have 10 more minutes.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we had a speaker we moved back in the day. So if anybody else has any burning questions, and I hope that you do.
Wow.
All right. We have time for one more question.
Well, there were people here holding up their
Yeah.
Want to follow the rules, which maybe we don't always do.
Hi, my name is Andy Clark. I'm from Radio Netherlands Worldwide. I just wondered if there's possibly a link. I was thinking about how people who actually contribute from the ground in the difficult areas can be helped more. Is that this trend on call to action with stories, is there some sort of link that could be made there by the call to action being something which leads to something more sustainable for stringers who may be, in fashion while the story is hot, but then when it goes, of course, you guys move on too. So, yeah, is that something that could be linked up together?
I think there's something very exciting about the Beacon Reader model, where you can actually subscribe to a writer who is covering stories you care about, and then that goes to help continue funding the collective. So you're seeing some, insofar as the beneficiary is the reporter and the freelancer, you want to make life easier for them to keep doing what they're doing. The kind of cause-linked journalism, it can be tricky because this is a raw space, and the question of if you're stoking empathy and then asking people to donate, is there a conflict of interest? Is there not a conflict of interest? To what extent does that happen already? The New York Times did an incredible piece about a young boy in Beirut who's Syrian, who basically goes to work every day for $7 to support his family of 4. He gets sexually abused for a few extra dollars so he can take it home to his family. And they told us more about it afterwards, but that wasn't in the piece. But all these sorts of, these incredibly heartbreaking story, and found readers contacting the New York Times to pour in donations to get the guy a scholarship to help the family move somewhere better, and they did. They became the conduit for that. So there isn't a hard and fast rule, and it's not even a paradigm shift. It's a question of whether it scales and how you institutionalize what would have happened anyway, and this role that the newsroom as the intermediary was playing in helping improve a bad situation.
This may be an over-sterilized way to think about it, but if you're building a news organization like the one that we're building, and your goal is to be able to, in a very short period of time, go to a place and tell a compelling story in virtually any environment, it behooves you to make contacts and make persistent contacts and build persistent benefit into the people who are your infrastructure in that place. I think that too long the concept of the fixer wasn't even like a thing in the public consciousness, and I think a lot of your work and sort of Twitter as a whole has exposed these people as being the boots on the ground when no one's got boots on the ground. And so we try and be there first, and we try and be there early on in a story before it goes off, but we're never there ahead of the people that we're going to end up relying on when we get there. And so I hope that we can build a business model that is built upon the ethic of supporting those people regardless. I think Andy's going to figure out a piece of it with legal protections and Pierre's dedication to this. We're going to think about a piece of this when it comes to just knowing we have to rely on these people all the time. And hopefully we work together and come up with what the next model is.
Thank you guys so much. Please join me in a round of applause for you.